April 18, 1942. Japanese naval commanders watched in absolute horror as American B-25 bombers flying at masthead height literally cut their invincible destroyers in half with concentrated machine gun fire that ripped through steel like paper. The Imperial Navy had prepared for high-altitude bombing attacks, but the Americans had secretly modified entire bomber squadrons into low-flying ship killers that could skip bombs across the water and unleash devastating 8-gun strafing runs that no Japanese vessel could survive. In less than 20 minutes, an entire task force was reduced to burning wreckage by tactics so unexpected that Japanese anti-aircraft guns couldn't even depress low enough to fire back. The few survivors would later describe watching American pilots fly through their own flak at wave-top level, accepting terrible losses to deliver a tactical shock that shattered Japan's belief in naval supremacy forever. But how did American engineers turn lumbering land-based bombers into the most feared ship killers in the Pacific? And why did Japanese intelligence completely fail to see it coming?
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. April 18, 1942. The morning sun painted the Pacific Ocean a deep blue as Commander Takeshi Yamamoto stood on the bridge of his destroyer. The sea was calm, too calm, he thought. His ship cut through the water at 20 knots, leaving a white wake behind them. Steam rose from the smokestacks. The metal deck was warm under his boots. Yamamoto had fought in many battles. He wore ribbons on his chest that proved his courage. His men respected him. The Emperor himself had honored him after Pearl Harbor just 4 months ago. That day, Japanese planes had destroyed the American fleet. The world saw Japan's power. Everyone said the Americans were finished in the Pacific. The commander walked to the chart table. Red pins marked Japanese victories across the ocean. Wake Island had fallen. The Philippines were almost theirs. Hong Kong was gone. Everywhere the rising sun flag flew, victory followed. His finger traced the shipping lanes near the Japanese coast. These waters belonged to Japan now. American ships would never dare come this close to the homeland. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka hunched over his radar screen in the communications room below. The green line swept around and around, showing empty ocean in all directions. At 23, he was the youngest officer on the ship. His father had been a radio engineer before the war. Tanaka understood the new machines better than the older officers, but he knew his place. He spoke only when spoken to. He followed orders without question. The radar screen showed 3 other destroyers in their patrol group. They moved in perfect formation across the water. Each ship carried over 200 men. Their guns could hit targets 20 miles away. Their armor could stop most bombs. These ships had sunk American cruisers and destroyers in battle after battle. The crew believed they were sailing on unsinkable ships. Down in the forward gun mount, Seaman Kenji Sato cleaned the barrel of a 5-inch cannon. His hands were rough from farm work before the Navy took him. His village grew rice in fields that his family had worked for 300 years. The war had taken him far from those quiet fields. Now he served the Emperor on the ocean. The gun oil smelled shark in his nose. The metal was smooth and cold under his cloth. Sato had learned to load shells faster than any man in his crew. The gun could fire 15 times per minute when the enemy came close enough. But what enemy would dare attack them here? They were only 50 miles from Japan. The homeland had never been touched by war. American planes could not fly this far. Their ships would never make it past the outer islands. The destroyer's engines hummed deep in the ship's belly. Black smoke rose from the stacks and spread across the sky. The anti-aircraft guns pointed up at empty blue air. Their crews played cards and told jokes. Some slept in the warm sunshine. Why stay alert when no threat could reach them? Commander Yamamoto had studied American tactics at the Naval War College. The Americans liked to bomb from high altitude. They flew their planes in neat formations at 20,000 feet. They dropped their bombs and flew home to safety. Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft guns were built to fight this kind of war. The guns tilted up towards the sky, ready for high-flying bombers that would never come. But something felt wrong this morning. Yamamoto couldn't name it. The water was too quiet. The radio chatter from other ships sounded normal, but underneath he sensed tension. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was the feeling every good commander got before battle. His grandfather had fought the Russians at sea 40 years ago. The old man always said the ocean spoke to those who listened. Lieutenant Tanaka wiped sweat from his forehead and stared at his screen. For just a moment, he thought he saw something at the edge of his radar range. Tiny dots, very low, moving fast toward them. He blinked and looked again. The screen was empty. Must have been seabirds, he told himself, or maybe clouds. The American planes were all destroyed months ago at Pearl Harbor. What few remain were fighting far to the south. The morning routine continued aboard all 4 destroyers. Sailors swabbed the decks. Officers checked their charts. The radio operator sent position reports back to headquarters. Everything was normal. Everything was safe. The ships were 40 miles from the sacred soil of Japan, protected by the most powerful navy in the world. Sato finished cleaning his gun and climbed up to the deck for fresh air. He squinted at the horizon where the blue sky met the blue sea. His eyes were sharp from years of watching for birds over rice fields. Something moved out there, very far away and very low. Too low for clouds, too big for birds, too fast for fishing boats. He started to call out to his gun captain, then stopped. What would he say? That he saw something that might be nothing? The officers would laugh at a farm boy who jumped at shadows. He was probably wrong anyway. Nothing could threaten them here in Japanese waters. The radio would warn them if danger was coming. But deep in his chest, Kenji Sato felt his heart begin to beat faster. Something was coming toward them across the water. Something that should not exist in these safe, familiar seas. The dots on Lieutenant Tanaka's radar screen grew larger. His hands shook as he adjusted the controls. The blips were real. They were moving at 200 miles per hour, only 50 feet above the water. This was impossible. No plane could fly that low for so long without crashing into the waves. He grabbed his phone and called the bridge.
Commander Yamamoto listened to the report and frowned. Low-flying aircraft made no sense. American bombers attacked from high altitude where they were safe from ship guns. Everyone knew this. It was how air warfare worked. But Tanaka was a good officer. If he saw something, it was real. The alarm bells began to ring throughout the ship. Sailors dropped their work and ran to battle stations. Seaman Sato jumped down to his gun position and began loading shells. His crew moved fast, but their movements felt dreamlike. They had practiced this drill hundreds of times, but never expected to use it near the Japanese coast. Through his binoculars, Yamamoto saw them first. Twin-engine bombers flying lower than he had ever seen aircraft fly. Their propellers almost touched the wave tops. Spray from the ocean splashed up behind them. These were not the high-altitude bombers in Japanese training manuals. These planes looked different, heavier, with extra guns sticking out of their noses like metal teeth. The first bomber grew larger in Yamamoto's vision. He could see the pilot's face in the cockpit window. The American was young, maybe 25, with a grim expression. His plane carried no bombs under its wings. Instead, 8 machine gun barrels pointed forward from the nose.
Yamamoto had never seen a bomber armed like this. It looked more like a flying battleship than an aircraft. The sound hit them before the bullets did. 8 .50-caliber machine guns firing together made a noise like thunder that never stopped. The roar was so loud that sailors pressed their hands over their ears. But the bullets arrived before they could take cover. Sato's gun mount exploded in sparks as the heavy slugs tore through steel armor like it was paper. Pieces of metal flew in all directions. The gun barrel, which had seemed so strong and safe minutes before, was cut in half. Men screamed as bullets the size of a man's thumb ripped through anything in their path. The destroyer's bridge windows shattered into 1,000 pieces. Yamamoto dove to the floor as bullets whined over his head. The ship's radio antenna fell in twisted pieces. The smokestack developed dozens of holes, and steam began leaking out in white clouds. In 10 seconds, the machine gun fire had turned his proud warship into scrap metal. But this was only the beginning. The American pilot pulled up slightly and dropped something into the water. It was not a normal bomb falling from the sky. Instead, it skipped across the ocean surface like a flat stone thrown by a child. The bomb bounced once, twice, 3 times, then struck the destroyer's hull just below the waterline. The explosion lifted the entire front half of the ship out of the water. Sato felt the deck tilt under his feet as if the ocean had turned sideways. Metal plates that were 3 inches thick cracked like eggs. Water rushed into the ship through a hole the size of a truck. The destroyer that had seemed so mighty now groaned like a dying animal. More bombers appeared, flying in a perfect line just above the waves. Each pilot had learned to skip his bombs across the water with deadly accuracy. They had practiced this technique for months in secret. While Japanese commanders expected high-altitude attacks, American engineers had created something completely new. The second destroyer in their formation took 8 machine guns worth of fire along its entire length. The sustained burst lasted 30 seconds. When the smoke cleared, the ship's superstructure looked like a cheese grater. Every antenna, every gun mount, every piece of equipment above deck had been shot to pieces. Men who had been standing proudly at their stations lay motionless on the blood-covered deck. Lieutenant Tanaka tried to reach his radio, but the equipment had been destroyed. Sparks flew from broken wires. The radar screen was dark. He realized with growing horror that this attack had been planned in detail. The Americans knew exactly where to hit to disable their communications and weapons. The third destroyer tried to fight back, but its anti-aircraft guns couldn't point low enough to hit targets flying at wave height. The gun crews spun their wheels frantically, trying to depress their barrels towards the water. The weapons had been designed to shoot at bombers flying miles above them, not at aircraft skimming the ocean surface. Yamamoto watched another skip-bombing attack destroy the 4th ship in their group. The bomb entered through the side of the hull and exploded inside the engine room. The destroyer broke in half like a stick. The front section sank in less than 2 minutes. The back half floated upside down, its propellers spinning uselessly in the air. The noise was terrible beyond description. Machine guns roared continuously. Bombs exploded with ear-splitting crashes. Metal screamed as it twisted and broke. Men shouted orders that no one could hear. Steam hissed from broken pipes. Water rushed into sinking ships. The peaceful morning had become a nightmare of sound and destruction. Sato climbed out of his ruined gun position and stared at the chaos around him. American bombers continued their attack runs, coming so low that he could see the pilots' faces clearly. They were not the soft, weak enemies described in Japanese propaganda. These men flew through deadly anti-aircraft fire without flinching. They accepted terrible risks to complete their mission. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The ocean around the Japanese ships turned black with oil and red with blood. What had been 4 mighty destroyers was now floating wreckage and desperate men clinging to pieces of wood. The water was cold and black as Commander Yamamoto floated among the wreckage of his ship. Oil burned on the surface around him, creating thick smoke that stung his eyes. Pieces of his destroyer drifted past him in the current. A life jacket, a sailor's cap, part of the bridge where he had stood so proudly just minutes before. Everything he had believed about Japanese naval power was sinking beneath the waves with his ship. His mind struggled to understand what had just happened. For months, intelligence reports had told them that American bombers were slow, high-flying targets, easy prey for Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft guns. The reports were completely wrong. These American planes had flown lower than anyone thought possible. They had turned bombers into ship killers with modifications that Japanese engineers had never imagined. Yamamoto grabbed onto a floating piece of wood and tried to think clearly. The Americans had not just attacked them randomly. This had been planned with careful detail. They knew exactly how Japanese ships were armed. They knew the anti-aircraft guns could not shoot low enough to hit wave-top attackers. They had studied Japanese weaknesses and created weapons to exploit them perfectly. Seaman Sato swam toward the commander through the oily water. Blood ran down his face from a cut on his forehead, but his eyes were alert. He had grown up poor on a rice farm, but he was a strong swimmer. The cold water reminded him of the irrigation ditches back home, except those ditches had never been filled with burning fuel and pieces of dead ships. As Sato reached for the same piece of debris, Yamamoto saw something that shook him to his core. The young sailor was not looking at him with the respect and obedience that Japanese military tradition demanded. Instead, Sato's eyes held questions. Hard questions about leaders who had sent them into battle unprepared. Questions about intelligence reports that had been completely wrong. Questions about a war they might not be winning after all. Lieutenant Tanaka floated nearby, still clutching his waterproof bag of radio equipment. Most of the electronics inside were ruined by seawater, but he had managed to save one small transmitter. His technical mind was already working on the problem that terrified him most. If the Americans could modify bombers this way, what else could they do? What other surprises were waiting for the Japanese Navy? The sound of aircraft engines made all 3 men look up. More American bombers were flying overhead, but these were not attacking. They circled the area slowly, and Yamamoto realized with growing shame that the enemy pilots were checking for survivors. Some of the planes dropped life rafts and medical supplies into the water. The Americans were showing mercy to enemies who had expected no mercy from them. This simple act of kindness hit Yamamoto harder than the bombs and bullets had. Japanese military training taught that Americans were cruel and heartless. The propaganda said they would torture prisoners and show no honor in battle. But here were enemy pilots risking their own safety to save the lives of men who had just tried to kill them. One of the life rafts landed close to Sato. As he swam toward it, he found supplies that amazed him. Clean drinking water in metal containers, medical bandages that were whiter and softer than anything he had seen in the Japanese military, chocolate bars wrapped in paper that kept them dry, even emergency rations that smelled better than the food served on his ship.
The quality of these American supplies told a story that contradicted everything Sato had been taught. Japan was supposed to be the advanced industrial nation. America was supposed to be weak and unprepared for war. But these simple emergency supplies were better made than the equipment Japanese sailors carried into battle every day. Yamamoto pulled himself into the raft and examined the medical kit with growing wonder. The instruments were precision-made. The medicines were clearly labeled with detailed instructions. Even the life raft itself was built with care and attention to detail that Japanese military suppliers had never shown. Every piece of American equipment spoke of an industrial system that could afford to make the best of everything. As more survivors gathered in the rafts, they began to talk quietly among themselves. The conversations were dangerous. They questioned things that Japanese soldiers were never supposed to question. If American intelligence was good enough to plan this perfect attack, what else did they know? If American industry could modify entire bomber squadrons in secret, how many other weapons were being developed? Tanaka stared at the small radio in his hands and finally understood the full scope of their defeat. The Americans had not just sunk 4 ships. They had proven that Japanese military thinking was completely outdated. While Japanese commanders prepared to fight the last war, American engineers were creating the weapons of the future. The young lieutenant thought about the radar equipment on his destroyed ship. It had been the most advanced technology the Japanese Navy possessed. But the American attack had been planned to destroy communications first. They knew exactly where the radar antennas were located. They understood Japanese ship design better than many Japanese officers did. Sato looked at the chocolate in his hands and remembered the stories his officers had told him about American weakness. They said Americans were too soft to fight a real war, too comfortable to make sacrifices. But these bomber crews had flown through heavy anti-aircraft fire at wave-top height. They had accepted terrible risks to complete their mission. There was nothing soft about men who would do that. Commander Yamamoto closed his eyes and felt his whole understanding of the war crumble like his ship had crumbled under those 8 machine guns. Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor believing that one decisive blow would force America to make peace. But America had not made peace. Instead, they had gone to work creating new ways to fight. They had turned the tools of war into weapons that Japanese planners had never imagined. The oil fires on the water began to die down as the 3 survivors floating in their American-made life raft, eating American emergency rations and slowly realizing that everything they had believed about this war was wrong.
September 15, 1945. The train wheezed to a stop at Tokyo Station with a long hiss of steam. Commander Yamamoto stepped down onto the platform, carrying everything he owned in a small cloth bag. His uniform was patched and faded. The ribbons on his chest looked dull in the gray morning light. Around him, other returning soldiers moved like ghosts through the crowded station. The city he remembered was gone. Where proud buildings had stood, empty lots stretched between piles of rubble. American bombs had flattened entire neighborhoods. The Imperial Palace still stood, but everything around it looked like broken teeth in an old man's mouth. Yamamoto walked through streets that had once bustled with confident citizens. Now thin faces stared at him from doorways with hollow eyes. His family's house in the suburbs had survived the bombing, but barely. The roof had holes patched with metal scraps. The windows were boarded up with wood. His wife Michiko met him at the door, and he saw how the war years had aged her. Her kimono was made from old curtain fabric. Her hands were rough from factory work. She had kept their home together while he was fighting a war that Japan had already lost. Their son Taro was 12 now. old enough to ask hard questions. The boy had grown up hearing stories about Japanese victories and American weakness. Now he wanted to know why his father looked so tired and sad, why the great Japanese Navy had been defeated by the soft Americans that the radio always mocked. Yamamoto looked into his son's eyes and realized he would have to tell the truth. Over dinner of thin soup and small portions of rice, Yamamoto tried to explain what he had learned in the water 3 years ago. He described the American bombers flying at wave height with their 8 machine guns blazing. He told his family how perfectly planned the attack had been, how the Americans had studied Japanese weaknesses and created new weapons to exploit them. But the hardest part was explaining the life raft, the clean medical supplies, the chocolate that tasted better than anything he had eaten during the entire war, the precision manufacturing that went into every piece of American emergency equipment. These details painted a picture of an industrial power that Japan had never understood. Lieutenant Tanaka had returned to his family's electronics shop in Osaka. The store was empty except for broken radios that no one could afford to fix. Parts were impossible to find. The American occupation forces controlled all the good equipment. Tanaka spent his days trying to repair pre-war devices with salvaged components and wire. But at night, he studied technical manuals that American soldiers sometimes threw away. The complexity of American radar and communications equipment amazed him. While Japanese engineers had focused on making things cheaper, Americans had focused on making them better. The gap in technology was wider than anyone in Japan had imagined. Tanaka often thought about the morning when those dots had appeared on his radar screen. If he had been using American radar equipment, he might have detected the bombers 20 minutes earlier. The Japanese ships might have had time to escape or call for help. But Japanese radar was built to minimum standards by the lowest bidder. American radar was built by companies competing to create the best possible product. Seaman Sato had returned to his rice farm, but the fields looked smaller and poorer than he remembered. The irrigation ditches needed repair. The farmhouse roof leaked. His parents had grown old while he was away, and the farm could barely feed one family, much less support a returning soldier. He often walked to the village shrine where his grandfather was buried. The old man had fought the Russians in 1905 and always said that Japan won because Japanese soldiers had better fighting spirit. But Sato had seen American bomber crews fly through heavy anti-aircraft fire without hesitation. Their fighting spirit was as strong as any Japanese warrior had ever shown. The chocolate bar from the life raft had lasted only minutes, but the memory of it lasted forever. That chocolate had been made by a country rich enough to give its best food to enemy survivors. Japan couldn't even feed its own people properly during the war. The contrast revealed an industrial gap that no amount of fighting spirit could overcome. Commander Yamamoto took a job teaching at a small naval academy that the occupation had allowed to reopen. His students were young men who still believed in Japanese superiority. They asked him to tell stories about glorious battles and heroic victories. Instead, he told them about American bombers that had been modified to skip bombs across the water like stones. He taught them that underestimating an enemy was the fastest way to lose a war. He explained how American engineers had turned weaknesses into strengths by thinking in ways that Japanese planners never considered. The most important lesson was that industrial capacity mattered more than fighting spirit when wars lasted for years instead of months. In quiet moments, Yamamoto still heard the sound of those 8 machine guns firing together. The roar that had cut his destroyer in half had also cut through his certainty about Japanese power. The Americans had not just won the war with better weapons, they had won it with better thinking. Years later, when Japan began to rebuild its economy, Yamamoto would remember the quality of that emergency life raft, the precision of the medical instruments,
The careful engineering that went into every piece of equipment, even supplies meant to be thrown away. America had defeated Japan not through cruelty or luck, but through the simple decision to make everything as well as possible. The lesson floating in that life raft surrounded by burning oil was clear. In modern war, the side that could afford to build the best of everything will defeat the side that built just enough to get by. Japan had learned this truth the hardest way possible, but it was a truth that would guide the nation's future long after the last destroyer had sunk beneath the Pacific waves. Winter came early that year, and snow began falling on the ruins of Tokyo in November. Yamamoto watched from his classroom window as American supply trucks delivered food to hungry Japanese families. The trucks were new and well-maintained. The drivers wore warm coats and good boots. Even the enemy's kindness demonstrated their overwhelming abundance. His students struggled to understand how Japan had miscalculated so badly. They had been taught that Americans were lazy and pleasure-seeking, but the evidence surrounding them told a different story. American soldiers worked efficiently to rebuild bridges and power stations. They organized food distribution with military precision. They treated their former enemies with a professionalism that impressed even proud Japanese officers. Yamamoto found himself defending American capabilities in discussions with other veterans. Many refused to accept that they had been outfought by superior tactics and technology. They preferred to blame bad luck or traitor politicians. But Yamamoto had floated in that life raft. He had seen the quality of American engineering in the smallest details. The occupation forces brought with them machinery that Japanese factories had never produced. Bulldozers that could move mountains of rubble in hours. Generators that provided steady electric power. Medical equipment that saved lives Japanese doctors had given up for lost. Each piece of American technology revealed the enormous industrial gap that had determined the war's outcome. Lieutenant Tanaka began working for the occupation forces as a technical translator. American engineers needed help understanding Japanese radio designs, and Tanaka needed money to support his family. The work was humbling but educational. American circuit diagrams were drawn with precision that Japanese manufacturers had never achieved. Components were rated for performance levels that Japanese parts could not reach. One day, an American colonel brought him a captured Japanese radar unit to examine. Tanaka had helped design the equipment before the war. Now he saw it through American eyes and felt embarrassed by its crude construction. Wires were soldered carelessly. Vacuum tubes were mounted without proper shock protection. The whole device looked primitive compared to American equipments. Tanaka often thought about the morning when those dots had appeared on his radar screen. If he had been using American radar equipment, he might have detected the bombers 20 minutes earlier. The Japanese ships might have had time to escape or call for help. But Japanese radar was built to minimum standards by the lowest bidder. American radar was built by companies competing to create the best possible product. Seaman Sato had returned to his rice farm, but the fields looked smaller and poorer than he remembered. The irrigation ditches needed repair. The farmhouse roof leaked. His parents had grown old while he was away, and the farm could barely feed one family, much less support a returning soldier. He often walked to the village shrine where his grandfather was buried. The old man had fought the Russians in 1905 and always said that Japan won because Japanese soldiers had better fighting spirit. But Sato had seen American bomber crews fly through heavy anti-aircraft fire without hesitation. Their fighting spirit was as strong as any Japanese warrior had ever shown.
The colonel asked polite questions about Japanese design philosophy. Why had they chosen cheaper components over reliable ones? Why had quality control been so inconsistent? Tanaka realized that Japan had been building equipment to work just long enough to win a short war. America had been building equipment to last for years of continuous operation. During the long evenings of occupation, Tanaka studied English technical manuals that explained American manufacturing methods.
Mass production in America meant making millions of identical parts to exact specifications. Mass production in Japan had meant making thousands of parts that were approximately the same. The difference in thinking had produced the difference in war outcomes. Seaman Sato married a girl from his village and started a small family. His wife had worked in an aircraft factory during the war, making parts for fighter planes. She told him stories about production quotas that demanded speed over precision. Defective parts were shipped rather than scrapped. Inspectors were pressured to approve components that would fail after a few hours of use. Sato compared these stories to the American life raft that had saved his life. Every piece of that raft had been built to work perfectly even under the worst conditions. The water containers had not leaked. The medical supplies had remained sterile. The emergency rations had stayed fresh for years. Someone in America had cared enough about enemy survivors to make their rescue equipment with love and attention. His children grew up hearing bedtime stories about the day their father learned to respect his enemies. Sato would describe the sound of 8 machine guns firing in perfect synchronization, the sight of bombs skipping across water like flat stones, the moment when he realized that everything he had been taught about American weakness was propaganda designed to make Japanese soldiers feel brave. Commander Yamamoto lived to see Japan's remarkable recovery in the decades after the war. Japanese companies began studying American manufacturing methods and improving upon them. The same attention to detail that had characterized that emergency life raft became the foundation of Japan's new industrial philosophy. Quality control became an obsession rather than an afterthought. He often wondered what would have happened if Japan had understood American capabilities before attacking Pearl Harbor. Would the war have been fought differently? Would Japanese leaders have chosen negotiation over confrontation? The questions haunted him because the answers might have saved millions of lives on both sides. The final lesson came to Yamamoto in his old age, when Japanese cars and electronics began outselling American products around the world. Japan had learned to combine American industrial methods with traditional Japanese craftsmanship. The student had become the teacher by first accepting that it had been the student all along. In his retirement, Yamamoto wrote memoirs that became required reading at Japan's new Naval Academy. He described the morning when overconfidence had been shattered by reality, the afternoon when survival had depended on enemy mercy, the years when defeat had slowly transformed into wisdom. The lesson floating in that life raft surrounded by burning oil was clear. In modern war, the side that could afford to build the best of everything would defeat the side that built just enough to get by. Japan had learned this truth the hardest way possible, but it was a truth that would guide the nation's future long after the last destroyer had sunk beneath the Pacific waves. But perhaps the deeper lesson was about the danger of believing your own propaganda. Japan had convinced itself that American weakness was real because believing in enemy weakness made Japanese soldiers feel stronger. The price of that comfortable delusion had been measured in sunken ships and floating bodies and years of occupation by the very enemies Japan had dismissed as inferior. The war had ended not with a glorious battle between equals, but with the complete collapse of one side's understanding of reality. And sometimes, Yamamoto reflected in his final years, that was the most dangerous defeat of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.